With the release of Alan Wake 2, a game which was easily one of my most anticipated titles of all time, when I set out to write the video for that game, I kinda hit a wall. So much of what makes that game work is really the culmination of what Sam Lake and the rest of the team at Remedy put into motion back in 2010. And as I was writing the Alan Wake 2 video, I kept falling into a trap where I was writing at length about the games that came before it. So instead of meandering and going off on crazy tangents, I've decided to dedicate my next few videos to Remedy's past, starting here with Alan Wake, then American Nightmare, and finally Control, before I finally end this little project with my proper video on Alan Wake 2. I will eventually go back and cover the earlier titles, but I feel that these three games more than anything set the stage for Alan Wake 2. Even if there are some pretty enthusiastic nods to Max Payne and Death Rally 2, if you can believe that. As a quick aside, I've already written a brief overview of Remedy Entertainment and their development history in my video on Quantum Break. So I'm not going to be as detailed in this video, but the main beats are a bunch of nerdy Finns from the demo scene got together and worked on some early games, got Death Rally off the ground, and then one of the co-founders hit up one of his friends from college to see if he could help write some English flavor text for the game, and then that writer by the name of Sam Lake never left the company once he came aboard, eventually helping develop the early style for the developer, as well as becoming the writer and the face of Max Payne. But after the fall of Max Payne fulfilled Remedy's contractual obligations to Take-Two, Remedy went back to the drawing board to develop a new IP. And after recovering from the dreaded crunch period of their last development cycle, and after eventually deciding on the tone for their next project, they started to build the framework of what would eventually become Alan Wake. But Max Payne 2 was released in October of 2003, and Alan Wake didn't hit store shelves until May of 2010, even after it was officially announced back in 2005 at the Electronic Entertainment Expo, or as most of us know it, E3. With one look at Remedy's development history, this 7-year gap is easily the longest stretch between releases that this company has ever seen. There was a 5-year gap between Death Rally and Max Payne, but when you go from this to this gigantic leap in production and technology makes that gap instantly understandable. When it comes to Alan Wake, the 7-year development hell has been fairly well documented. While certain aspects of the game came together fairly quickly, like the basic setting, protagonist, TV series pacing, mood, and even pop culture influences that defined the early trappings, other aspects such as the plot, game mechanics, enemy design, and overall vision of the game went through constant revision. Remedy Entertainment had become victims of their own success. Max Payne was a landmark franchise. It put Remedy on the map, and the team, they wanted their next project to be their biggest and most ambitious title to date. Where Max Payne had been linear, Alan Wake was going to be a large-scale open-world experience taking place in the fully realized town of Bright Falls, nestled in a fictional part of America's Pacific Northwest. And where Remedy's version of New York was perpetually draped in darkness, this new title was going to strive for realism in this new setting by including a real-time day and night cycle and even both dynamic and scripted weather systems. Ideas were constantly being updated and experimented with. Different enemy types and even physics systems were thrown into the scope of this ever-growing project. Vehicles, dynamic encounters, survival mechanics that forced the player to explore the environment during the day to prepare for the threats that came with the darkness of night, and even the strange ability to manually shift between day and night at the will of the player with the help of a magical light switch were thrown into this increasingly large list of features. Sam Lake and Mikko Rautalahti were tasked with writing the narrative, and while certain touchstones from the final game were present even in this early state, and the Twin Peaks and Stephen King influences were already well defined and moving the plot forward, the ever-changing design of the project put the writing team into a bit of a bind, as each new revision of the game brought new aspects and dynamics that would change how the story would be told. They had a skeleton of a game, but it was twisting and changing with every revision. Games like Grand Theft Auto 3 and its sequels had set the bar of quality required to make a convincing open-world game by this point, and new tech and consoles were on the horizon. And after unveiling their first demo at E3 of 2005, Remedy began to shop the upcoming title around before finally finding their publishing partner with Microsoft in 2006. But with this massive corporation offering resources and support to the studio, Microsoft also became involved in the development to a certain degree, as well as becoming the holders of this new IP. According to Lake, it was around this time that tensions at Remedy were mounting. They felt that they were failing, that this project wasn't going to live up to the hype, that it was going to let their publisher down, and that they were already missing milestones. And most importantly, the team themselves, they were unhappy with the project. Remedy halted development and formed what Sam Lake refers to as the Sauna Group, an internal strike force of sorts comprised of all the leads of each department. And it was named such due to the heat and the pressure that the team had found themselves under. This splinter team was tasked with taking all of the moving parts that Remedy had developed up until this point, figuring out what could be utilized, what had to be scaled back, and what overall changes had to be made in order to salvage this title. And after roughly 2 months of planning and revising, this group completely reworked the project. The game was no longer going to be open world. The map would still be present, but now there would be a linear path with guardrails to propel the player through the environments that they created. Encounters would be scripted, survival mechanics would give way to a more action-focused experience, and the narrative would be rewritten around this new structure. The day-night cycle would be largely cut, even though the new narrative would be divided into chapters which would make full use of these lighting systems by dedicating certain sequences to different times of day. With each of these chapters utilizing a TV on DVD style motif, complete with an ending song at the end of each of these sections, and then followed by a previously on segment before launching into a new chapter. With Sam Lake more or less utilizing the binge-watching habit that many formed with TV seasons being suddenly made available on DVDs around the time of the development that Alan Wake had started. This was not the game that the team had worked on all along, but it was the framework of the final version of the title. And with Microsoft choosing to make it a tentpole release for the Xbox 360 console, Microsoft worked with Remedy to have the game out before summer of 2010. But not before releasing a short television show called Bright Falls, produced by both companies a few weeks before this game's release, with the project acting as a prequel to the game and also as original content for Microsoft's TV on Xbox initiative. The show featured a cast and plot that tied into the setting and overall tone that the game would showcase, and while it is short and sometimes betrayed by its budget, it is effective in its atmosphere, world building, and laying on its bizarre Twin Peaks-inspired atmosphere. But with all of these setbacks and changes to this title, how did it turn out? Alan Wake eventually came out to strong critical reception, it sold well, moving over 2 million units within its first 2 years, and it seemed to gain momentum as time went on, developing a strong cult following with word of mouth seeming to keep the sales momentum alive. Microsoft and Remedy would support this title with 2 DLC expansions, and then later a standalone follow-up called Alan Wake's American Nightmare. But when it later came to developing a proper sequel, Microsoft declined. And it was at that moment that Alan Wake's fate seemed to be sealed. That is until Remedy was able to acquire the rights to their franchise in July of 2019. And that brings us to today with Alan Wake Remastered, released in October of 2021, and the actual topic of this video. I should start this overview and review of sorts with an admission. This is not my first time playing the game. I had played it back when the Steam version was released back in 2012. And I only make a point of mentioning this because typically I have been reviewing titles after my first playthrough. And while there are certain exceptions to this rule, since I had previously played Diablo 2, Twisted Metal Black, and even a little bit of the first Final Fantasy before covering them, going back to Alan Wake was a little more tricky when it came to putting aside my biases. One, when I played Alan Wake back in 2012, it quickly became one of my favorite games that I had ever played up until that time. And although I have not gone back to replay it after all these years, just letting it exist in my mind as a particularly strong memory, this title represents the first time on this channel that nostalgia has an opportunity to color my opinion. But the other tricky part of looking at the first Alan Wake game is that this title serves as the foundation for pretty much everything that Remedy has done since. And today, playing things like Alan Wake 2, obviously, but also Control and even Quantum Break, this foundation makes those games hit differently when you've been along for the ride. Playing Alan Wake 2 in a lot of ways felt like the culmination of 13 years of work from this studio. Even though it could be argued that the promises being fulfilled didn't truly come into view until 2019's Control, as Alan Wake 2 really seemed like a pipe dream until that game came around. But with that out the way, what is Alan Wake? Or more specifically, what is Alan Wake Remastered? Despite its lofty ambitions, the game that we ultimately got is fairly simple in execution. What we have here is a narrative-focused third-person shooter that catapults you from one plot beat to the next, with some sections opening up for narrative beats or widening out to facilitate light exploration. But with the game having this tighter and more linear experience than was originally planned, this final version lends itself to what ended up being Alan Wake's greatest strengths, and those are both its storytelling and atmosphere. And just as a warning, there are going to be pretty heavy spoilers from here on out, so consider yourself warned if you'd like to avoid them. For the uninitiated, Alan Wake starts with a Shining-style aerial view of the idyllic town of Bright Falls. Stephen King is name-dropped within the literal first sentence of the game, and we learn that Alan Wake is a writer.
My name is Alan Wake. I'm a writer.
But we first get hands-on action with him in what turns out to be a dream, or maybe a better word for it is nightmare sequence. Alan is driving through the hills of Bright Falls at night, rushing to an unknown destination, but cognizant of the fact that he is running very late. And in his haste, he strikes a hitchhiker with his car. But when he gets out of his now wrecked vehicle to observe the scene, the hitchhiker is gone. Leaving the scene on foot, Alan makes his way towards a light off in the distance, but he is made aware that the hitchhiker is now back on his feet and teleporting around him while covered in darkness. This specter makes his murderous intent known by brandishing an axe and chasing after Alan while spewing nonsense about how Alan needs to suffer for toying with people's lives in the fiction that he has been creating. The writer is chased through the wilderness, punctuated with small tutorials teaching us Alan's defensive options when unarmed. And these include dodging, which, while functional, are a bit silly looking in practice, as timing them well results in a cinematic dodge, where time slows down, and while these seem to be a very clear nod to Max Payne, they do feel a little weird in practice. And we also learn that Alan can sprint, but that is for a very short amount of time before running out of stamina. Before replaying this game, I thought I remembered Alan's sprint as weak, but actually playing this game again today, especially after Remedy's other titles, this thing is pitiful. I mean, we are talking worse than even the patched version of Grey Hill Incident. But I will get more into the weeds of the gameplay side of this title in a bit. So, for now, back to the story. After proving you can dodge with the best of them, Alan is chased until he reaches a bridge, and the hitchhiker suddenly turns into a force of darkness, almost like a tornado or something, and that begins chasing the writer. Eventually, Alan hears someone shouting out to him, a man named Clay who is telling Alan to get inside of the building that he's standing in front of, and when Alan comes into view, apparently this man recognizes the writer, but things are cut short as Clay is cut down by the axe-wielding murderer. But not before we learn that this shadowy figure is more or less bulletproof.
No! Damn it, die! No!
Alan then finds himself locked in the cabin with no discernible way out. And things get even stranger as TVs begin to turn on and threaten the writer, until a supernatural force slams into the cabin, leaving Alan injured inside. And at the last second, a way out materializes in front of us. But as this happens, we are given directions by a disembodied voice that seems to be emanating from a seemingly sentient light source. This voice will eventually be given a name, and I'll get around to that in a bit, but for now it seems to operate as some sort of aid in this dream realm, being able to materialize things like stairs, doorways, and light sources, all while being fairly cryptic in its communications with Alan.
Are both wilder and more serene. To its ports I've been. To its ports I've been. Do you understand?
No.
Follow my light.
But for now, this light focuses on teaching the writer how to stay safe in the darkness. Light sources like street lamps are now safe havens, acting as both checkpoints and healing our character simultaneously. The voice also arms us with a revolver and flashlight and teaches us the main mechanic of this game, which is fighting people who have succumbed to the darkness. And as far as gameplay goes, this entails focusing your flashlight beam onto a cloaked enemy, burning away the darkness long enough, and then pumping them full of lead. And it is at this point that the voice notifies the writer that he will now give Alan his dream back. And the goal then becomes reaching a lighthouse out in the distance. We are chased by more enemies, and eventually more of that darkness weird tornado bullshit, but eventually Alan finds his way to safety. And once he is in the lighthouse, it is at this point where the dream ends, and so does much of the tutorialization. The writer is awakened by his wife Alice, and now back in the real world, the couple finds themselves on a ferry as they close in on the town of Bright Falls proper. Here we learn that Alice is a photographer. We get a call from Alan's best friend and agent, Barry Wheeler.
Yeah?
Hey, bestseller, how's my favorite writer? Are you there yet?
and Alan speaks to a few locals in passing, some of which are thrilled to see a famous author in person, and one dude in particular that seems to think that the writer from New York represents a yuppie in his mists, and he is not too thrilled. Once in the town proper, Alan finds himself in what has to be the most obvious Twin Peaks reference in this entire series, because, well, the Oh Dear Diner is more or less a one-to-one recreation of the Double R Diner from that show. Alan goes inside to find one Carl Stuckey, a local mechanic who has the keys for the couple's rental cabin, but instead he meets a waitress and self-proclaimed superfan of the writer by the name of Rose, as well as a few other local characters like the town's resident rockers, over-the-hill old dudes by the name Tor and Odin. But it is in looking the place over for Stuckey and running into the town eccentric Cynthia Weaver looking into the dark hallway at the back of the restaurant where the supernatural begins to bleed into the real-world setting. Cynthia tells Alan to be careful in the dark, but as he continues to the back, he meets a mysterious woman in funeral garb who says that Carl has fallen ill, and she hands Alan a key to the cabin as well as directions for their vacation home. It is pretty clear that something isn't quite right.
I wish you a good stay in my cabin. I'll come by later to check how you've settled in. And to meet your wife. I insist.
And as Alan returns to the front of the restaurant, things keep up this off-kilter vibe as the rockers start to address Alan as if he is an old friend of theirs.
Yeah, splendid. It's been a long time, Tom. Good to see you.
Hey, you wouldn't happen to have a bottle on you, would you, Tom?
I wish.
And we are also told by a local police officer that Tor and Odin are residents of a local assisted living home called the Cauldron Lake Lodge. It is at this time that Alan returns to Alice, and as the pair drives off to their cabin, they just miss Carl Stuckey running out to give them the keys to the actual cabin that they had rented. They then drive and find themselves at the Bird Leg Cabin, a tiny structure on a small plot of land known as Diver's Island right in the middle of Cauldron Lake. Alan sets up the cabin before Alice goes in because she is afraid of the dark, and Alan remedies this by providing the house with power with the help of a nearby generator. As the pair settles in, Alice tells Alan to come upstairs to see a surprise that she has prepared for him.
Alan, I'm upstairs. I have a surprise for you.
Well, hello there.
I'm not the surprise. It's in the study.
But what starts off as a playful little moment in what seems to be the beginning of a relaxing vacation quickly turns sour as tensions plaguing Alan and his relationship with Alice bubble up to the surface.
Surprise!
Alice? What is this?
I guess I have a small confession to make. I thought maybe you could write here that a change of scenery would get you past...
Damn it, Alice, everyone keeps...
Hey, just hear me out. There's a local doctor, Dr. Hartman. I read a book of his. He has a private clinic here. He specializes in helping artists. Maybe...
So now you want to get me committed?
No, it's not like that. That's not... Alan? Alan?
Just don't! I don't want to hear it! God damn it, Alice!
The writer storms out after a quick shouting match with his wife. Alan has been struggling for the last 2 years with a crippling bout of writer's block. He is unhappy about it, his agent has been pushing him to get the ball rolling, and now in the middle of what he thought was a romantic getaway with his wife, this sudden reveal of Alice moving behind the scenes to use this trip as a sort of creative retreat is too much for Alan. I'm going to put a pin in this interaction for now, but I will just say this right away before coming back to it to actually discuss both Alan and Alice's characters in a little bit more detail later. Alice planning a trip around secret motives is not the way to go about helping somebody deal with a problem that is deeply affecting them. It is manipulative and just pretty uncool overall. But Alan throwing a tantrum and then utilizing Alice's phobia against her to get some space, also really uncool. And it is kind of the first real instance we get at seeing that Alan, at least at this point in the story, is kind of a dick. But as Alan is wrapping his head around this childish behavior, things take on a much darker tone as Alice lets out a panicked scream that could be heard well outside the cabin.
Damn it. Alice? Alice? Alice!
Alan runs back to the house to check up on his wife, but quickly sees that something has gone horribly wrong. The cabin is completely dark, and the back door which leads out to both a small boat dock and the lake itself is wide open. And when Alan goes to investigate, he sees a lifeless Alice floating just below the surface of the lake. Without much time for thought, Alan plunges himself in after her, but as soon as he breaks the surface of the water, the player is shown a few bizarre images before we cut back to Alan, but now he is in a completely different, but somehow more perilous situation. Without any real explanation, the writer has now found himself far away from Cauldron Lake in his own wrecked car that has more or less gone off the side of a cliff, with the man sustaining some light head trauma in the process. Alan decides to make his way towards the closest sign of civilization, a gas station off in the distance, but things become even stranger, and in some key ways, the actual game that we play for the rest of this title's runtime starts here as Alan trudges through the forest and is met with what seems to be the same sentient light from his dream before. But instead of manipulating the world around him or dropping cryptic poetry bars, the light simply drops some typewritten pages at Alan's feet. And it is here where the writer's reality begins to completely shift, as these pages seem to be part of a new manuscript supposedly written by Alan himself. A manuscript that Alan has no recollection of writing, with the title for the new novel being Departure. And while this might serve as a minor spoiler at this point, these pages detail the events of the plot for the entirety of the game.
At first I kept finding the pages as if by accident. The book I couldn't remember was either a terrible and true prophecy, or an act of creation that had rewritten the world. I began to hunt the pages feverishly, for they held the answer to the mystery. With it, I could save myself. With it, I could save Alice.
Even spelling out some plot beats before they actually happen. Alan continues further on his path, but it is at this point where he comes across the figures from his nightmares come to life. And in this first encounter, he comes across the axe-wielding Carl Stuckey himself, spewing nonsense and out for blood. At its core, this is what the gameplay loop of Alan Wake is from this point on. Hit a plot beat that propels the narrative forward, but ultimately the story will always find a way to place Alan back in the woods at night. A night that acts as the home for these dark figures that Alan learns from his own writing are called the Taken. You run through the trees armed with a flashlight and gun, with enemies never too far behind you, and you either run towards the nearest light source that stops the enemies in their tracks, or you arm yourself with an arsenal that makes sense in the context of this small town in the wilderness setting, and you take the fight to the Taken. There are revolvers, shotguns, and hunting rifles, but there are also survival tools, such as road flares, flashbangs, which feel a little weird in this context, but they take the place of grenades found in other action shooters of this kind. And then there is the flare gun, which functions more or less like an RPG against the Taken. Fighting these guys pretty much always boils down to the same tactics, even if there is a little room for nuance when it comes to unique enemy typing and raw numbers. Where the tutorial taught the player to focus their flashlight onto the enemy and burn away the darkness, things can become a little tense as the beam might be effective for slowing down a single target, but all other enemies continue to advance on you, or more annoyingly, just throw little sickles at you from a distance. And that is where crowd control really comes into play. Dropping a flare at your feet acts as an area of an effect tool that keeps enemies at an arm's length, and there is a little nuance for your flashlight, as focusing the beam by holding down the aim button burns away the shadows effectively, but it also burns through your battery very quickly. And in these situations, you also have the choice of just pointing the thing at the enemies like you are hip firing the torch, albeit at a significantly slower rate. It does help with conserving resources. But this darkness mechanic can be bypassed altogether with the more powerful weapons at your disposal, like the flare gun or the flashbangs, as their concentrated firepower just drops the enemies on impact. Enemies come in a few different flavors. You have these smaller dudes called flankers that bum rush Alan, but they go down in just a few shots from whatever weapon you are wielding. Common Taken, which take a few more shots to drop, but they advance more slowly and typically just start chucking weapons at you from a distance. And then there is the assault class, which are big dudes with sledgehammers and the like, and they just kind of Michael Myers you and take a lot more light to burn away their shields. This is a pretty straightforward action game, even for the time that it came out back in 2010. Aim your resources at the enemies until you can deal out damage and identify which enemy types require your immediate attention. And while it would be a stretch to call any of these systems groundbreaking, they are perfectly functional and at least in a few ways showcase a fairly clever design philosophy. With 2001's Max Payne, Sam Lake set out to get rid of a trope in video games that had bothered him for quite some time, and that is the weird bit of dialogue that can occur when a player character talks to themselves in order to communicate information indirectly to the player.
Let's see here. I ruined my marriage, drove my best friend away, got 2 psychos in their army after me. And now my brother's gone missing.
Max Payne avoided this by leaning into its genre conventions. In film noir, which is clearly the main influence to Lake's writing for Max Payne, it has long since been a trope where hard-boiled detectives reference a journal, case notes, or even an active interrogation to act as an internal voice for the leading character as they both move the story forward and set the mood with a metaphor-drenched monologue.
Rorschach's Journal, October 12th, 1985. Dog carcass in alley this morning. Tire tread on burst stomach.
As more and more people turn to crime and violence, the town becomes gripped in fear. Dark times.
And Max Payne lifted this convention to great effect.
They were all dead. The final gunshot was an exclamation mark to everything that had led to this point. I released my finger from the trigger, and then it was over.
Alan Wake continues this tradition with the found manuscript pages, as it becomes more and more clear throughout the plot that all of Alan's voiceover is actually being read to us by him from the finished novel that we've been collecting.
I knew she wouldn't follow me in the dark. I needed some time alone to think things through.
But even in Alan Wake's combat, this same careful thought process colors the action. The enemies are hikers and lumberyard workers, not shock troopers. The weapons outside of the flashbangs make perfect sense in their setting, even if finding some of these weapons is an exercise in suspension of disbelief when it comes to how conveniently they're placed, but more on that later. And having the power weapons and flashlight upgrades tied directly to this light versus dark motif solves the power creep found in action games of this generation, without just handing Alan a fucking rocket launcher. And when it comes to the gunplay, there is a very often overlooked detail that I found key to the immersion present in this title, and that is just how clean this UI is. Sure, you have a little beacon on the left that points you towards your objective, and that is admittedly not the most creative solution, especially considering how lampposts often act as signposts anyways, and you do still have the Max Payne style resource indicators present. But this HUD is fairly minimal, especially for the time that it came out. And what impressed me most was the absence of an on-screen reticle. Alan is a civilian, and as such, there is no need for iron sights, hit markers, or even that booger that people used to put on their computer screens to no-scope me with the op back in the Counter-Strike 1.6 days. Here, your reticle is just your flashlight. Point the beam at an enemy, the Taken will shield their eyes to let you know that you're on target, a lens flare of sorts contracts to let you know how much darkness remains before you can deal real damage, and once the shield pops, you just unload, you shoot into the light. It may not be the most realistic thing to have your bullets land exactly on target with your flashlight, but in terms of player feedback, it is up there with Isaac Clarke's rig suit in terms of how well it communicates exactly what the player needs to know at a glance. And with the aid of some fairly sensitive controls and just the right amount of auto-aim and magnetism on each target, it makes this gunplay feel very snappy and very precise. And with none of your weapons really offering a true auto-fire or even semi-automatic fire, it makes the gunplay feel extremely deliberate and everything just works. And the light also plays into exploration, as very early on in the game we are introduced to weapon caches that are signposted with reflective paint that only shows when Alan's light comes in contact with it. And really that is kind of Alan Wake's main strength, its immersion and atmosphere. You feel like you are in the middle of a horror story come to life. The way that the beam of your flashlight bounces off of trees and cuts through the fog, the way each environment feels connected to your journey, and structures that you can see off in the distance all seem to be some real measurable distance away instead of just hidden behind some sort of loading screen, the way collected manuscript pages, radio shows, and even the in-world TV program of Night Springs tend to foreshadow the horrors that have yet to come, everything here is in service of its atmosphere and its narrative. And things like the audio design for your flashlight burning away the darkness or the cracking of the revolver lend themselves to making this place feel exceptionally well realized, especially when we consider this game's age. And the environments and how they play with the light, some of them look downright painterly in their execution. And while a lot of this might just functionally be set dressing, it does anchor you into this experience. As the narrative trucks along and begins to unravel itself, we follow the trail regarding Alice's disappearance. We make it to the gas station. We meet Sheriff Sarah Breaker, who's initially suspicious of Wake, and between his conversation with Sarah and some environmental clues, Alan learns that a week has passed since he jumped into the lake after Alice. And at Alan's insistence that the couple had been staying at Divers Island, Sarah takes Alan to Cauldron Lake to show him in person that the island he has been claiming to have stayed on no longer exists. With the police now involved, Alice's disappearance becomes an actual missing persons case. But given the lack of any real evidence to go on, Wake is suspected of having some sort of involvement, but is ultimately free to go without anything to book him on. Sarah wants Alan to stay in town and tells him that she needs to know where he will be staying in order to reach him in case she has any further questions, but ultimately for now he is a free man. It is also at this time that Alan meets Dr. Emil Hartman, the same man who Alice had been in contact with about Alan's writer's block, and in a lot of ways one of the main reasons Alan and Alice came to Bright Falls in the first place. So this interaction goes about as well as you'd imagine.
I'm Dr. Emil Hartman. I'd like to invite you to stay at Cauldron Lake Lodge.
Did you talk to my wife?
I had the pleasure of discussing your situation with her on several occasions.
Did you set something up with her?
I invited her here. My clinic is a place where...
Oh, hey!
It is also at this time that we meet Alan's agent, Barry Wheeler, and it is in this interaction with Hartman and from some of Barry's comments that, again, we get the sense that Alan is still a bit of a dick.
Get me out of here.
What the hell was that about, Al? We don't need a replay of that thing with the paparazzi. I thought they were gonna lock you up.
From here, the story jumps around a bit, sometimes to clue us into different plot developments, but sometimes seemingly just to get Alan back out into the woods at night so the action gameplay can take the wheel for a while. And I think that it is here where the game and the pacing of its story is ultimately at its weakest. There is this whole plot thread around Ben Mott, the guy who called you a yuppie back on the ferry, who supposedly kidnapped Alice and has been holding her hostage. And between his manipulations, he manages to get Alan out into the woods quite a few times that night, including one particular section where he just refuses to show up to meet Alan, and that just kind of dragged the pacing a little too long for my liking. And these constant missions and diversions out into the woods, I don't know. The combat is good, but it is never the high point of this game. And by the end of these missions, Alan reaches an almost Nathan Drake level of bodies left in his wake. And the action, while solid, it does become a bit samey as the body count continues to grow. Especially when every firefight ends with the same style of slowed down cinematic. Other supernatural elements are added into the fray to spice things up, like moments where darkness manifests as something resembling a storm, and this causes enemies to spawn periodically until Alan reaches a safe haven. And while these sections are cool in theory, as they act as sequences in which Alan should stop fighting and take off running, I've already mentioned how his stamina is dubious at best, and again, the perfect dodge mechanic makes things a little cheesy after a while because you get that same similar slowdown mechanic. And while I have no proof of this being an example of publisher meddling, there is this character by the name of Emerson that we meet later in the game at Hartman's clinic that has a little something to say about publishers making contributions that makes me rethink the use of this mechanic.
My nightmare is the publisher people who want to make a contribution so they can say they made a contribution. And then we end up with mullets in there because they think mullets are funny. But it wasn't supposed to be about mullets. And now it's about mullets. And when it's in slow motion, they call it mullet time because the numbers came back from marketing that mullet time is the hook we needed to go big in the target demographic. And they're not even kidding. They say it all like serial killers with straight faces and smiles.
But these storms of darkness that serve as infinite spawn points, they also betray the explorative nature of this title. As the last thing that you want to deal with while you are looking for the manuscript pages to get the most out of this plot is an endless wave of enemies punctuating your search. There are also poltergeists that take over appliances and other inanimate objects, from steel barrels to combine harvesters that are thrown at Alan in an attempt to build up some specific set piece battles. But while they are fun in kind of a silly way, they often feel more stupid than scary. And then finally, there are birds that get sprinkled in to quite a few encounters as a clear nod to Hitchcock, but again, not really scary and more of just a diversion, but back to the story. There is a thread where Rose from the Oh Dear Diner has been touched by the same dark entity that has been creating the Taken, an entity by this point referred to in Alan's manuscript as the Dark Presence, which seems to be a primal force but also capable of manifesting itself as the same woman in black that gave Alan the key to the cabin on Diver's Island. And this thread ends up with Alan and Barry being drugged by the waitress in order to delay Alan from gaining traction against the Dark Presence. We are also introduced at this point to FBI agent Nightingale, and while his backstory is a little messy, for the sake of this review, he's distrustful of Wake and suspects him as being behind not only the disappearance of Alice, but also all of the chaos that has been happening surrounding the Dark Presence. And while he is portrayed as a classic loose cannon type character with an itchy trigger finger, it is in his constant literary figure references that he uses as insults towards Wake that I became a huge fan of this character.
Well, I've got you now, Raymond Chandler.
Whoa! Get back in the cell, Stephen King. This is Agent Nightingale, FBI. Get him up, Hemingway.
I mean, seriously, some of these are just great.
Nowhere to run now, Dan Brown.
And I find some of these particularly hilarious because when it comes down to it, Alan, at least as he is portrayed in this title, he's not really the best writer.
Toby knew the smell. It was the man, the nice man who always gave him treats and never got tired of playing with him. Toby wagged his tail in excited anticipation and gave a joyous bark.
Feeling more like the kind of author you might read after picking up a bestseller from an airport bookstore than a Hemingway or even Stephen King. Really, at this point, the narrative becomes a wild goose chase. Talk to this guy, end up at this place, try to figure out what's going on, get forced out into the woods at night. But eventually, Alan's chase leaves him in the care of Emil Hartman, who tries to do that everything you know is a lie. Everything that you've experienced this far into the game has actually been a delusion caused by you losing your wife, and she actually drowned in Cauldron Lake type thing. And Emil Hartman, after finding an unconscious Alan Wake, he basically institutionalizes Alan against his will in what we learn is a ploy to harness Alan's gift as a writer. Hartman is more aware of what has been happening this far in the story than anybody else. Cauldron Lake has a power that is in league with the Dark Presence that allows for fiction to become reality. The Presence uses it to gain influence and power, and Hartman seeks it to build up his own influence and power. We learned that Alan is experiencing something that has happened before in Bright Falls. Once back in the 70s, when a poet by the name of Thomas Zane stayed at Divers Island until his partner Barbara drowned in Cauldron Lake, and it was through Emil's influence that Zane attempted to use the power of Cauldron Lake and write Barbara back to life. And while it did work, this Barbara was not the same person Tom had been romantically involved with her essentially being body snatched by the Dark Presence. And this Barbara was more or less the same manifestation that we've been encountering in this narrative as the woman in the funeral dress. This Dark Presence manipulated Zane into writing further for it to gain more power, but once Zane realized his mistake, he cut out this Barbara's heart and then wrote himself and his partner out of existence, sinking into the lake forever. The sentient light that Alan first encountered in his dreams is a version of Thomas Zane. Even though things have gotten far more complicated since the release of Control and Alan Wake 2, but for now, I'm going to keep things as they are presented in this first game for now. And this man in the diver suit that sometimes comes to help Alan is essentially trying to help the writer in his battle against the Dark Presence. And on a more sad type of side note, Thomas Zane in this first game was voiced by James McCaffrey, the same voice actor behind Max Payne, Director Trench in Control, and Alex Casey in Alan Wake 2. He passed away just this past December after a battle with cancer, and the industry will be a little less special with his absence. He was an iconic actor, and there will always be a void in Remedy's future titles caused by his passing. Rest easy, James. You will be missed, and let's hope that we can always reach you on the hotline. Back to the story, we learned that the Anderson brothers, Tor and Odin, have also battled with the Dark Presence before, and that their music was also used to change reality in the past. And after meeting both of them in Emil's facility, they tell Wake to go to their farmhouse where they left a message for him. And again, this is what I mean about the writing kind of existing in its current state in order to give us more action sequences. There's really no reason that Tor and Odin couldn't have just kind of told him what their message was, but after a lengthy battle out of Emil's lodge, and an even longer section towards the farmhouse, which includes a battle set to a heavy metal soundtrack and pyrotechnics, Alan and Barry eventually find a record of Tor and Odin's band, the Old Gods of Asgard, in which they more or less instruct Alan to find the Lady of the Light. And again with the side notes, while the Old Gods of Asgard are fictional, they are very much a real band called Poets of the Fall. And these guys are friends with Sam Lake, and have also previously collaborated with Remedy with their inclusion of their song Lake Goodbye used in Max Payne 2. The song actually debuted in the game, later being released as a single in 2004, before being included in the band's debut album Signs of Life, which released in 2005. Poets of the Fall also lent the track War to be used in Alan Wake as both a diegetic track to be found in the game, but also as one of the chapter ending songs. And while music from the Old Gods of Asgard has been included in Control and Alan Wake 2, and even joined Sam Lake on stage at the Game Awards in 2023, it was here in Alan Wake where we were first introduced to this fictional band. But I don't know, given the fact that you can buy like physical music on vinyl from Old Gods of Asgard, I don't know if this quite counts as a fictional band anymore, or if it's just some sort of bizarre side project. But back to the farmhouse, after more or less being given their next instructions, Alan and Barry decide to do the sensible thing for once and stay put during the night, and instead decide to get trashed in the farmhouse on Torrin Odin's homemade moonshine.
I'm a writer, goddammit.
Correct.
If I just wanted to, I could write 10 books a year. And they'd be the best books that year.
No, you couldn't.
That's right, I couldn't. But I could, because I'm a writer.
What?
And it is in this drunken stupor where Alan recalls his lost week essentially writing Departure at the behest of the Dark Presence, except he wrote in some safeguards in order to try and save Alice, as the Dark Presence had been holding her captive. Except instead of being able to find the Lady of the Light in the morning, the pair are tracked down by Nightingale, and they wake up hungover in Sheriff Breaker's jail, with Nightingale having seized Alan's manuscript and hoping to use it as evidence against the writer. But upon speaking to Alan, he realizes the pages have already outlined this very conversation before he is set upon by the Dark Presence.
Whoa! Get back in the cell, Stephen King. The only way you're leaving this place is over my dead...
Wait a minute. I know this.
At this point in particular, the plot becomes very video gamey, with Sarah Breaker more or less recognizing the threat that they're up against, alerting a secret society of sorts, and then the two battle through the streets of Bright Falls to get to a helicopter to take them to Cynthia Weaver, the woman from the beginning of the game telling Alan to be careful, as she is the town eccentric who is obsessed with keeping the lights on, and Barry is separated from the pair just long enough to gear up in his iconic armor against the Dark Presence. In true Alan Wake fashion, the journey to Weaver has a bunch of diversions and firefights, but eventually we get there, and Cynthia has more or less been tasked all these years with safeguarding an artifact left by Zane. In an earlier sequence in the game, one which I had omitted up until now, there is a playable sequence in which we see Alan in his New York apartment with Alice. There is a power outage, and we get to see firsthand how much she fears the darkness. Once Alan helps her by lighting some candles to make her feel safe, she asks him to tell her a story, and Alan obliges by recalling a story from when he was very young.
Tell me a story, writer.
Okay. I used to have these nightmares when I was a kid. The dark really spooked me, too. When it got really bad, my mom gave me this old light switch. She called it the clicker.
The clicker, huh?
Yeah. If I ever got scared of the dark, I could just flip the switch and a magic light would scare the monsters away.
Oh, sure.
It is a sweet moment, and it paints Alan in a positive light for once. Even if there is a separate sequence later in this apartment, which basically shows him as being a pretty big douchebag, as he had been spending his nights partying and getting loaded on booze, and then having to chase off the headaches with some Max Payne style painkillers. Dude was such a mess that he didn't even remember his appearance on a TV interview the night before, which he sat right next to his own creator, Sam Lake. It seems kind of important to me, and it is clear that this type of behavior for Alan was something of a habit. But this clicker scene is nice. This is the object that Cynthia has been safeguarding, and Thomas Zane had even written a plot beat that brought the clicker here, which more or less means that Thomas Zane would have had to have written Alan's backstory in order to have him here now, but again, this is something that has become a little bit more nuanced with Alan Wake 2, but for now, Cynthia more or less gives Alan the tool he needs to truly combat the Dark Presence. Armed with the clicker, Alan goes back to Cauldron Lake, but with the cabin no longer where it had been in the beginning of the game, Wake throws himself into the lake again and finds himself in the Presence's domain, a realm that Alan refers to as the Dark Place. Alan had to come here in order to get back to the cabin with the story left unfinished in the typewriter when he initially broke free of the not Barbara's control. He also meets the diver here again, who gives him this bizarre message.
You must find your way to the cabin. It stands in your way. It won't let you pass. It has no heart. It's filled with darkness. You must fill its heart with light. Don't mind him. He's Mr. Scott. Your friends will meet him when you're gone.
And once Alan is finally able to battle his way back to the cabin, he encounters Barbara before destroying her by shoving the clicker into the hole that had been used to remove her heart, and switching the light switch on. Alan then finds himself at the typewriter, but creating an ending for Departure doesn't come without certain sacrifices.
I understood what I had to do now. I knew how to write the ending to Departure. There's light and there's darkness. Cause and effect. There's guilt and there's atonement. But the scales always need to balance. Everything has a price. That's where Zane had gone wrong.
And with this new ending, Wake traps himself in the dark place, freeing Alice in exchange. And after some ending fanfare that shows life moving on with Alice freed and Deerfest going on without a hitch, we see one final sequence with Alan where he leaves us on this cryptic note.
It's not a lake. It's an ocean.
This is not the end of the story, however. 2 DLC chapters were added as this game's epilogue after the initial release, with the final chapters coming out in October of 2010, leaving some players a bit disappointed, as these chapters are necessary in understanding the true ending of the first game, and given the fact that both of these chapters are fairly short and utilize a lot of recycled environments from the main game, some obvious criticisms were levied against the way that these were released. Luckily, nowadays, you can just buy the remastered version, and both of these chapters are included, but it wasn't the greatest look back in 2010. Without doing the same beat-by-beat recap that I just did for the main game, this is the basic gist of both of these chapters. The signal shows us Alan trapped in the dark place where things are surreal and volatile, with the encounters proving to be even more numerous than the main game. Thomas Zane is guiding Alan, trying to keep him safe, before it is eventually revealed that we are only playing as a version of Alan, more specifically the rational side of his mind, and the Alan that we played as in the main game has been driven insane by being trapped in this dark place. The writer is more or less Alan's attempt to save the insane version of himself as he navigates the even more surreal hellscape of the dark place. Alan is forced to fight off figments of his imagination, including versions of his friends like Barry and the Old Gods, fight hordes of enemies, including a pretty brutal ascent to a lighthouse, and navigate some pretty bizarre environments. But the story ends with Alan finding himself back at the cabin and reuniting with the insane version of himself. With Alan made whole again, he knows what he has to do if he wants to escape this dark place, and that is write himself back into the world with the manuscript that he sets out to write called Return. And that is where the writer was left until 2012's Alan Wake American Nightmare, but that will be the topic of my next video. Replaying Alan Wake, for lack of better words, was really nice. It had been over a decade since I had last gone through this version of Bright Falls, and while I thought I remembered most of the details, certain things came flooding back in clearer view than I expected. And what I had fondly looked back on as one of the best games that I had ever played now took shape as just a really dope game from 2010. If I'm being honest, replaying Alan Wake after having played Quantum Break, Control, and Alan Wake 2, I was hit more by this wave of realization that the team of Remedy has been constantly honing their craft, and in a lot of ways they have continued to outdo this title from 2010. Their storytelling has improved, their world building is far more cohesive, and their presentation has become, at least with Alan Wake 2 in particular, world class. But you cannot argue that in a lot of ways, this game is the bedrock on which all of those titles have been built. And with the fight to create Alan Wake 2 stretching all the way until 2023, Sam Lake and Remedy recognized this and refused to let Alan's fate go unaddressed. This is a good game with a great story, and a few design and narrative choices that really dig their hooks in. The pacing can be a little all over the place, with far too many enemy encounters for the story being told, and it feels more in line with something like Uncharted or even Kane and Lynch Dog Days by how every plot beat seems to advance the story as well as just act as an excuse to throw more enemies on the screen. Alan is a lot more unlikable than I remember him, even if that ultimately does make him more redeemable by the end. But one thing that really stood out is Alice. Alice is far more of a nothing character than I remember, with her basically just playing the damsel in distress. And with her spending so much time, understandably, from a plot perspective off screen, she just seemed more like a plot device than anything. And with her fear of the dark and meddling in Alan's affairs, she seemed to be more of a pawn in this give me back my wife narrative than I remembered. And while the early 20s version of myself didn't even notice the camera focusing on her ass in a couple different shots, the post-Gamergate version in my 30s couldn't help but take these shots into consideration. And then there was a collectible in the Signal DLC chapter where you can find these cardboard cutouts similar to the one of Alan that we saw in the Oh Dear Diner for some of the supporting cast. And it refers to Alice as having a muserific booty, which, you know, in my 30s is just kind of a cringe thing to read more than anything. It's just, I don't know, kind of stupid. And then there is the question of who actually wrote this in-game detail. Is Alan referring to his wife as Bootylicious while he's going insane in the dark place? Because that's the only plausible explanation here, other than one of the writers just getting a little too bricked up during crunch, or the Dark Presence being particularly appreciative of Alice in that regard, which is also stupid. I'm not bringing this up because I'm offended by it, it just feels dated, and given how much Remedy has improved in their storytelling and characterization, especially with characters like Jesse Faden or Saga Anderson, and then how well they've expanded upon Alice between this game and Alan Wake 2, this just feels more like growing pains than anything. But for every little stumble here and there that I can point out, there is a certain magic to the quieter moments of Alan Wake. Manuscript pages are an incredible solution to the narrative problems Sam Lake continues to address, the important plot beats hit hard, and simple things like the way that the flashlight just plays with everything in the environment adds a level of realism that is just not present in many games. And then things like hearing the Anderson brothers refer to Alan as Tom made me realize that this plot was far from over back in 2010, and that the writing team really was pushing the intrigue over a decade ago. The cast is memorable, even some of the dumber moments are quirky and fun, and it is a solid action game even if it does become a bit repetitive at times. And then there is the whole meta-narrative thing that I find endlessly fascinating. With Alan Wake, Remedy has kind of written themselves a cheat code, and they have already begun to toy with it in Control and Alan Wake 2. Course. But we now have a character that has the ability to bend reality to his whim through fiction. And in a pretty meta way, any shortcomings or oddities that show up in the plot or the pacing suddenly feel less like poor scripting by the team at Remedy and more like the ramblings of an airport writer who is desperately trying to write himself out of a corner. Weapons are too conveniently placed. Of course Alan would do that for himself. Having to go out into the darkness one too many times, I don't know, maybe he couldn't figure out a better way. And so on. There is a brilliance to this game, and even though it wears its influences on its sleeves, there really ain't anything else like it. The remaster came out at the perfect time, and although some changes like losing the in-game product placement are understandable, even if I did find some of the old shots hilarious even in the original release, and even if it ultimately did ruin this one stupid Verizon joke that Zane kinda lays on you.
Hello?
I'm trying to reach you. Can you hear me? Can you hear me now?
Can you hear me now? Good. Can you hear me now? Good.
And then there are the nice things like having Sam Lake's commentary that are really appreciated, even if they kind of interfere with some of the audio tracking at times.
It had gone dark. All the lights were out.
Another beginning that also was a lot in my mind already working on Max Payne games.
And as of right now, this is the definitive console version, as being able to play this game in 60 frames per second is just a dope thing. If you find yourself wanting to go back to experience Alan Wake, this is an easy purchase. If you are curious about Remedy's connected universe, you should probably start here and play the games in order to get the most out of it. Just recognize that it is an older game nowadays, but I still think that it's foundational to some of the best stuff that the industry currently has going on. If you made it to the end of this video, thank you for watching. It is always greatly appreciated. And if you liked the video, please consider subscribing, liking, or even dropping a comment below. As I said at the beginning of this video, this is the first in a series of 4 videos on Remedy Entertainment's games, starting with Alan Wake. And with that being the case, I felt that it was important to really go over this game with a fine-tooth comb. But going forward, I will not be utilizing the same beat-by-beat analysis of the plot, as I don't think that they factor into Alan Wake 2's enjoyment nearly as much as this game did. And while it may sound like I've slightly outgrown this title compared to how much I loved it when the game actually came out, I wouldn't say that's the case. It's just aged, but I still find it endlessly entertaining. But with that being said, I hope to see you in the next video on Alan Wake's American Nightmare. But until then, thank you for watching. You're all beautiful people, and I hope that you have a great day.